countries we're coming from, and because I'm a researcher, this is how I like to present it. So we got a nice map. The countries in red are the countries where we've got government officials. The countries in blue are where people have flown from for this conference, but they're not necessarily representing their country. So huge diversity. What I wanted to say before I started is that I see myself, kind of my role and Richard's role, as basically we're researchers who are providing a framework. I'm probably more excited than you are, because this for me is an opportunity to share the research that we've done and validate that research, receive feedback, actually kind of get real-time comments and experience from the countries that I've been desperately looking for documents and books, and it's actually, there's not much written about this topic, which is why I was so excited when I got to do this piece of research for DFAT. A lot of the experience that exists come from Latin America especially. There's not much written about experience in other countries. And in fact, I wanted to apologize in advance if you don't see some of your country experience reflected here. So, for example, I know that Cambodia, Philippines, for example, they've been working on similar projects of integrated data and information management, and that wasn't reflected enough maybe in this version of the paper. Maybe in the future we will be able to have a kind of updated version where we have an even more global perspective for this paper, thanks to this workshop. So us as researchers providing a framework, that's what I want to be doing now. Provide a framework for us to all be discussing together. So what am I going to be talking about today? We're going to be first asking why integrate data and information management, and then what does this actually imply in practice? And we'll see that the answer isn't that obvious as one would expect. So while the first question, why integrate? There's a lot of agreement, and I've decided to represent this agreement just with this kind of quite basic visual representation. And you also should have a copy of the presentation inside your folders. You'll see that there's a bit more text. For actually presenting, I've reduced the text to the minimum. But if you do want to come forward, yeah, please do. So it's interesting because going through documents, kind of country documents of why they chose to integrate data and information management, you see bits and pieces of these motivations, but not necessarily all of them. So what I wanted to do was just give a comprehensive picture of why it may be useful to integrate data and information management. So already when one starts thinking about designing an integrated system for data and information management, even that first very conceptual stage where you haven't done anything yet, already that thinking process helps to bring policy clarity. Why do we want to integrate? What do we want to integrate? Kind of across which sectors? How far do we want to go with integration? It helps to maintain a focus on inclusiveness and responsiveness, and to really try and think kind of who is it that we're trying to reach with this, thanks to this integration? How do we address kind of structural poverty? How do we address those that are kind of vulnerable to cyclical poverty? How do we adopt a life cycle approach to addressing poverty issues at different stages of someone's life cycle? Then, of course, there's the whole issue of the linkage to the wider policy. So you already at this initial stage, you're already starting to think through who are the other actors that may help me to achieve this level of integration. Who do I need to be linking with, especially kind of within the social policy, so health, education? Which are the institutional arrangements that I need to be pursuing? Then when kind of, if one has started actually developing a system, that the next step is you start to collect data for your integrated system, unless if you have the data already, and we'll be discussing this later. And that simple process of data collection, it means that you're avoiding duplication of efforts. Maybe before you had 5 different programs, each of them collecting their data. Thanks to integration, you can actually have one single effort for data collection. You have less burden on staff, less paperwork, less reporting, kind of all of that can be automated, and that can be a huge gain in terms of efficiency. I'm using the word common entry point. This is something that the ILO is very keen on, for example. You can establish just one entry point for any type of social protection program, And that again is kind of has huge efficiency implications. When your data starts being produced, you also have another series of advantages. If, for example, you've adopted some form of a common targeting approach, which is not necessarily the case. This is something we really want to repeat at this conference. Integration is not necessarily about targeting. Targeting is one of the benefits that comes from integrating data and information management. It's not the only benefit, and some countries actually choose not to integrate targeting. But if you do, you may have you may find that you can ensure a more equitable approach, which is based on objective and comparable information. You can avoid fraud and what in the terminology is we call double dipping. So people actually taking advantage of several different programs at the same time, and then once you look and cross-check the data, you realize that it's the same person and they shouldn't be receiving all of those benefits. This third bullet, kind of establishing common systems, incredibly important. This basically I mean, social protection, there's a lot of systems and operations that are implied kind of when you're building a social protection system, and some of these can be integrated across programs. So to again increase efficiency and effectiveness. So the most obvious one is the payment systems, and quite a few countries do this. They integrate payment systems across different programs. So you've got, of course, economies of scale thanks to this. You could be integrating the monitoring of conditionalities if you have a conditional cash transfer, for example. So the fact that your program can link to, I don't know, a registry of school attendance means that you can immediately monitor whether those co-responsibilities for your conditional cash transfer are being followed. You could integrate grievances, incredibly important. I mean, if grievances are often kind of similar for different programs, especially if targeting is common. So to have an integrated approach to grievances could be, again, huge efficiency gains in terms of management. And of course, there's the whole issue of the updating of information. Again, kind of information can be updated on a live basis. If you integrate with a civil registry, for example, you can see kind of as soon as a child turns a certain age, you can see that they're eligible for a child benefit or a school subsidy, so you can basically target your population based on information which is coming live from a civil registry. And this implies better management. In the long term, they're not benefits that you necessarily see immediately. So long term, I'm not talking about 10 years, but already after 2 years of running your program, your integrated system, you might be able to kind of have useful data that gives you oversight and kind of helps to have an integrated approach to monitoring and evaluating several schemes, seeing which ones are performing better compared to other ones. And maybe you realize that two programs are actually, they're not complementary enough and you need to tweak things. And that process of monitoring and evaluating is essential, and very often it's underappreciated. Big increase in transparency and accountability. I know that quite a few of your countries have been, for example, advertising, publishing some of the data that comes from the integrated database, for example, on a website, so that kind of citizens can have access to that, and that increases transparency of the whole social protection system. The increase in knowledge on poverty and vulnerability goes a bit of a step further compared to that oversight and M&E function. This could mean, for example, sharing your data set with research institutions, with people who not only use it for kind of operational purposes, but also elaborate on that data to understand who are the poor within the country, and feed back into the policy of how these could be targeted better, how social programs could be designed better. And of course, then there's the whole issue of effectiveness in general of addressing poverty. So, I mean, one thing which some countries have been experimenting with has been emergency response. So if you have a national integrated database of people who and could be targeted, could be included in a social protection program because of their poverty profile. If you have an emergency in a certain area of that country, you already have data on the people that you could be targeting. So I know that in Pakistan, for example, this was the case when the flooding happened, and there's huge potential for this. And another thing, of course, is transition between schemes as well. That could kind of increase effectiveness as well. Okay, so these are the reasons, and as I said, a lot of agreement on this across countries. Maybe some of you cite the targeting effectiveness more than some of the other reasons, but they're all important. These reasons can be divided into kind of ones which are more focused on policy, which are the ones that I circle here in red, or more focused on kind of operations. This is just to give you a sense. And this, I like this photographer because he has this wonderful series on bureaucrats and their offices. And this gives a sense of what can happen when you don't try to have a system to manage information, is you just have pile-ups of records that aren't useful. And that's the whole point of integrating. The ultimate objective is actually making sure that this information is useful and it's used somehow. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if any of you know of offices in your country that look something like this. Okay, so a lot of agreement on why, not a lot of agreement on what this implies in practice. That's partially because there's very different country experiences, and it's also partially because there's different objectives pursued by different countries, and I implicitly, I was kind of pointing at this before when I was saying that some countries, that the main focus is to provide oversight, coordination, and planning. And I've put, some of you will recognize the Kenyan government logo there. I just chose the Kenyan government because that's what I know that has been happening in Kenya, is that the objective of integration there has been to provide oversight, coordination, planning. So they've kind of succeeded in integrating data across 5 different programs in the country for this objective. In some cases, and this is very driven by the World Bank, there's a strong focus on consolidating targeting. So reducing the inclusion and exclusion errors in social protection. And but that is not always the case in all countries. But it's a big objective that's been pursued in a lot of the countries that we've reviewed for this study. A third objective, which is very much pushed by the ILO, is the integration of operations and services. So, as I was saying before, for example, having a single entry point, and what the ILO calls a single window service. And if you want to discuss more about this, you'll have an opportunity even in the Meet the Experts session. We have an ILO representative, if you want to lift your hand. Okay, so the way things are set up in practice really depend on what your key objective is. These may be overlapping. It doesn't mean that you only follow one, but what your main objective is will change how you actually approach integration. And the other thing, of course, is the historical trajectory within your country. So where are you coming from? What systems exist? What capacity do you have? What level of kind of hardware infrastructures, kind of software capability do you have? Okay, so what has this led to? Quite a lot of confusion. So in general, when as a researcher going through the documents that discussed data and information management, you just see a lot of words that are thrown at you, and different countries are using the same words to mean different things, or different words to mean the same thing. So what did we do as researchers? We took a step back and said, wait a second, we need to make some order here. So how do we impose some order? So we built this framework around breadth and depth of integration. And you'll be seeing this chart again. So if you bear with me for 1 minute, I'll just explain it in a bit of detail. It's actually quite simple, not rocket science at all. So on the vertical axis we've got integration, and breadth of integration, and on the horizontal axis we've got purpose and use, so the depth of integration. And you'll see. So let's focus on the vertical one. You can either, have an MAS at the program level. So that's not integrating anything in a sense. So that's kind of step 0. So you have one program, and within that program you have a good MAS system that allows you to kind of have these functions of targeting, coordination, etc., etc. The next level would be integration across social assistance. So just non-contributory social protection. And this is the case in many countries. We found that actually integration was happening mostly within the social assistance. So it wasn't really across social protection. So actually there wasn't integration with formal social insurance. Very often there wasn't integration with health insurance. So that's the kind of second level that we could say of integration. Then you could have integration across the social protection sector, so including social insurance, possibly active, passive labor market policies. And the fourth level is the cross-sector integration, so where you start integrating with health, maybe with education, with other ministries that act in the social sector. On the horizontal axis, these are more controversial because none of these are necessarily sequential, and some of them are slightly overlapping. As I was saying, these are the 3 main objectives that we were discussing before. So you may have a targeting, kind of an integrated approach to targeting, and also have some form of integration of operations and services, and also, of course, have a integrated M&E function. But it just gives you a slight sense of kind of progressive levels of complexity and cost, especially. So you might be just coordinating that oversight, kind of an M&E. You may be kind of focusing on targeting, which already involves a higher level of complexity, or you may be trying to integrate other operations, so payments, grievances, monitoring of conditionalities, and all of those things I was discussing before. So what happens basically, as you move up, by definition, kind of the complexity and the related costs increase. It doesn't necessarily mean that that top right corner is the best place to be for you. So this is something we should really keep in mind. So where you are on this framework is linked to what your objectives are and what your country situation is. So, and actually sometimes, maybe even I've put in the top right corner, I've put Chile, Brazil, and Turkey. So they're integrating across sectors and across operations and services. But they're not necessarily integrating also within the social protection sector. So I know that Brazil, for example, it's integrating across social assistance and then out kind of to other, health, education, but they don't have kind of full integration with social security, for example. So they've leapfrogged in a sense. Is this clear? Does this make sense? Okay. Yes.
What is your favorite choice? Which one is the most ideal?
Yeah. So that's what I'm trying to say, is that there's no perfect ideal, because it really depends on what the country wants. So that's why we were very reluctant in the study to then pinpoint and say this is where you want to be. It's definitely, of course, getting to that far right corner. It means the greatest investment. It means kind of, it requires a lot of coordination. We'll be talking about the challenges and what it means to get there. But it's not necessarily the best place to be. And I want this to be very clear. So another thing that we wanted to clarify as researchers was the terminology. And maybe for you it's obvious, because within your country you are using a consistent terminology. The problem is that different countries are actually using a huge variety of language in order to describe what they're doing when they're integrating data and information management. You don't necessarily have to read this. This is just to give you an idea that people are using the words registry, they're using the words database, they're using the word MAS, and sometimes you don't really understand what is what. And a lot of you have an IT background, you've been working on this for a long time, so maybe you'll find what I say is obvious, but I want to say it anyway, just for clarity's sake. Okay, so Richard would be better at me at explaining this, but what I wanted to do is just take a step back and say, okay, what are the building blocks? So you've got, on one side, you've got a database or a registry, and this, I mean, a lot of people say, what's the difference? The difference is more semantic and kind of the history of the word, right? Kind of right now, today, they actually mean the same thing. So a database is a system to organize, store, and retrieve large amounts of data, and a registry, it is a word that comes from pre-ICT times. So it's an official written record of names or events or transactions. But today, they've actually come to mean the same thing. While an MIS is a system that transforms that retrieved data from the database into information that can be used for efficient and effective management. So this is at the program level. So we're starting at the basic level, but actually at an integrated level, it's the same thing. So you've got two building blocks for an integrated system. You've got the database or registry, which houses the comprehensive information on potential and actual beneficiaries. And we represent this throughout the study. You'll see this rectangle kind of with, and we've chosen the word single registry because it's the one that's most used in the written literature. It doesn't mean it's the best word. So this is one of the words that are being used. And in fact, we believe the reason it started being used is because of Brazil's Cadastro Único was the most studied. And it was translated originally as single registry. But it's interesting that now in recent translations of the Cadastro Único documents, they've started to be translated as unified registry. So it's interesting that even Brazil shifted how it's translating the Cadastro Único. So single registry can be a confusing word. Why? Because the registry is not necessarily single, because there's other registries in the country, and it doesn't comprehend all citizens in the country. It's not necessarily national, because many social protection programs are targeted maybe in the poorest areas of the country, so it's not necessarily a national registry. And yeah, it doesn't entail a single process, for example, for targeting individuals. So it can be a confusing word, but it's the word that we choose because it's the most used by the literature. And then you have an application software, so that's linked to this single registry, and we call this the integrated MIS, so IMIS. So what it does is it systematically transforms data and information, links it to other databases, and analyzes that data. So again, this is providing some structure, linguistic structure. So you can see that in this list that I showed you before, kind of quite a few people are using the word database, quite a few people are using the word registry, and a lot of people are using the word system or MIS. So we can actually trace some order even in how countries are calling their own system. Right. So I'm going to pass the word over to Richard to finalize this presentation.
So thanks, Valentina. So I'm going to build on what Valentina has just explained, looking at these particular concepts and looking in terms of laying the foundation, putting together into building blocks, okay? So I think the critical question we want to ask ourselves is, looking at all those particular, using the term database, registry, integrated management information systems, what would be the typical or common model? Because I think that was the question which I think my colleague from Indonesia was asking. What would be I think I don't want to use the term ideal, because again, I think it pushes everybody again to try to focus so much. And yet from our research, we are realizing that I think in countries, it depends on the context, it depends on the objectives, it depends on the level of integration. So if you look at this particular diagram, we are trying to say, if you were to actually draw a model, if there was a country that was starting from scratch, what would be a typical kind of a setup that you would want to actually achieve? So if you look at the very bottom, you will see some data collection effort. You would want some harmonization. You'd want to sign, for example, a questionnaire. You want to collect that particular data and build up into a single registry. Okay? So you want that particular data collected. You would want to apply some targeting index. Okay, so it could take different forms, for example. It could take, for example, proxy means test. It could be some other different types of ranking that you have. So you'd want that particular effort to be consolidated so that we don't have multiple efforts going on. That would be an ideal, more or less like a common typical model. You'd want to have some integrated management information system that links to that particular registry or single registry and shares that information with a number of programs. So for example, so if this particular registry would have information, for example, for say, it would give information to say an orphans or a child benefit. It would give the information to an elderly program. It would give the information to a poverty-based kind of a program. And you can see, for example, in this particular model, there could be potential that these particular programs could be maintaining their own individual management information systems. Okay? So they could be collecting a subset of this particular registry and using that particular data to manage a number of operations. So there could be a number of other, for example, interlinkages that could actually be done even within, from these particular programs or functions. But in actual sense, that would be how we'd like to see that. I think Valentina is telling me I need to go a bit slow. Okay, thanks so much. So you can, so I think again, so you see, for example, the way the linkage would actually practically work. And there would be, if that particular model were going to be set up, you would actually see this particular integration giving some sense of consolidation of monitoring, giving you the reports across that would actually come more or less like from all these particular programs. So there would be a bit of M&E reports coming out of these particular integrated management information systems. And then across the other sectors, these particular integrated management information systems would also link to some registry. So for example, in some countries, for example, I would give an example of Pakistan. You've got the Benazir Income Support Program doing some validation. So you've got, for example, the integrated system doing some validation with the NADRA, the National Database for Registration of Persons. So you want to do a bit of that interlinkage so that, for example, the data you have on the registry here is a bit validated if there is a bit of a national ID database, okay? So you have a bit of civil registry. Of course, this could also take, there could be birth registration information. There could be also registration of the death. Then you have, for example, also some links to the local institutions. This data could also serve some other bigger purposes in terms of policy work. We don't want only to see it in terms of the national level consolidation. There could also be use of this particular information also at the local level. And then I think Valentina has already mentioned other institutions, other sectors. So for example, there would be an ideal setup, for example, links to, for example, education. There could also potentially be links to health. And I think that it would be most exemplified by the presentation from Turkey team in terms of this particular link. If they would need, for example, to validate and to verify with the conditional cash transfer programs, again, as for example, health co-responsibilities or education co-responsibilities, this would also be a very ideal kind of a setup. So that gives you, for example, a schematic, a conceptual view of a typical model if you look at it from the IT perspective. But I think we want to emphasize that if all these have to work, we need some form of unique ID system, okay? And I think you'll see from the case of Brazil, for example, that in the case of Brazil, there's already a registry, but they don't have a unique national ID within the country, but they're able to actually implement and actually enforce this. But I think if this were to work in a very seamless way, you would want, for example, the data at the single registry level here to have some common form of unique ID so that when you do the linkages with other institutions, when you link to, say, education, when you do the linkage to health, then you're using the same common ID across the country. But we know, for example, that is not the case in most of the countries. A number of countries have some unique form of ID. In some cases, these IDs don't cover the entire population. And we know, for example, that the social protection systems are actually designed to actually reach out the most vulnerable. And sometimes the ownership or access to ID, again, among this particular category is not normally very, very high. So you've got almost like that particular challenge. So that gives a bit of a picture. So again, we know, to emphasize, we know that countries are not starting from this particular model, okay? So I think we don't have to really, we need to actually emphasize the fact that we are starting from our own context, we are starting from our own current model which exists somewhere. Yeah.
Targeting system is in the single registry line, but my confusion is here. The targeting is more focused on the program level rather than on the single registry.
Yeah.
So, if we use this same term in two cases, that confuses the user.
Yeah.
So, do you have any idea that this targeting system can be renamed? I mean, oh, sorry. Should I repeat it? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm just kidding. Yeah. Targeting system in the you said that targeting system is linked to the single entry, single registry, but that is targeting system is more used at the program level rather than at the macro level, like single registry. So one confusion arises on this issue.
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit of this?
Let me just explain that. Valentina can maybe add. I think as it is, I think Valentina mentioned that we've got almost like 3 or so objectives why we would want to actually do data and information integration. One of which is targeting, consolidation of targeting, harmonization of targeting. Unfortunately, it's one of the most popular. Okay? It's actually, unfortunately, it's one of the most popular. And you will see in terms of the model, so it's one of the most popular. So if we were to do a registry, set up a registry in terms from scratch, and the objective were to actually do it for the sake of targeting, we would want to collect this information, put it into a particular registry, have some form of ranking of these particular households, using some means, okay? Assuming that was the purpose of targeting. And then this information would be shared, would be given to different programs, actually would be targeted. For example, the ones, I mean, if it's a program targeting children, they would actually pick a subset of that particular data using some form of common ranking criteria, okay? They would go with that. Another one for the elderly would actually pick that information, assuming the objective was targeting. But again, I have to emphasize the fact that the other two objectives why you want to have data and information integration that you want to do. Valentina, do you want to actually give it another go?
No, just quickly. Well, we will be discussing this tomorrow as well, of how kind of you can have an initial targeting process at the national level, and then for programs, they can take specific aspects of that targeting and adapt it to their program needs. And also these dotted lines represent things that can or don't have to necessarily happen. So, for example, some programs may not have a targeting system kind of at national level, some integrated models. Some may not exchange data for operations. Some may not even have kind of a systematic process for M&E and oversight. So anything that is dotted, it means it could or it could not be there.
Okay. So I think the next session, we just want to quickly, I mean, in terms of the next presentation or slide, we want to look at different practical approaches to populating information for the single registry, okay? So I think this will actually explain clearly, from our research, there isn't one single model that you use to populate a single registry, okay? So if you look at the first model, we are calling it a centralized model, okay? So in this particular case, it means there is a very clear plan to set up a single registry and populate it with the data. So it means efforts are actually done from the outset. A questionnaire is designed, teams are sent to the ground, they collect this particular information, either on demand or actually on census method, and that information is populated and it's called into one particular registry called the single registry. Again, I think I don't know, I mean, we've explained the terminology very well. So that is centralized. And you've got, for example, examples are Chile, Indonesia, and quite a number of others in Latin America. There is a push, a specific effort to actually set it up as a database that could potentially be used by other programs. Then we got the second model, and the second model is program-centered model. In this particular case, a specific program which has already been established acts as a basis for collecting the information which is actually kept as part of the single registry. So, for example, in the case of Pakistan, the Benazir Income Support Program, they did a mass registration of 27 million households. This particular program, Benazir Income, actually created a big database of 27 million households, and that particular program now, this particular database or registry, is used by a number of other small programs. For example, they've got Wasila Italim, they've got Wasila Hack, graduation programs and others. But we can see, for example, that the push was driven by one specific program. Okay, so we can see in terms of the population of the registry.
Call this the kind of piggyback model, because you already have a program that's made a huge effort, and you can piggyback on that program. So it's more efficient, effective to use what's already there rather than start a new data collection effort.
And also potentially, of course, you would want, in terms of the maintenance, already some of the costs would have actually been budgeted for in terms of the program would already have some administrative costs in terms of collection of the data and all that. So you want to really support that. So you've got, for example, Brazil as an example with Cadastro Único, and I've got Jennifer, and I think she's going to demonstrate this at some point also. We've got Pakistan, Benazir Income, and we've got Indonesia, the UDP database. Yeah.
This was Indonesia pre-2011. So Indonesia now has gone towards a centralized model. But before 2011, it was actually piggybacking on the BLT program.
So I think the next model, we have the consolidated model. And what do we mean by this? A very good example is the Kenyan one. So we have, for example, in this particular model, we have a number of programs that already have their own databases. They have their own management information systems. And what you want to do is you want to do more or less like a warehouse. You want this particular program, program 1, program 2, program 3, to consolidate common information to build into one particular single registry. So for example, I think Valentina already explained, and we've got the Kenyan team, you can clarify later. We've got in Kenya 4 cash transfer programs within the social assistance sector. We've got the elderly program, we've got the disability program, we've got one program targeting 4 particular poverty-based program called Hunger Safety Net program. And what they've done in the single registry is they consolidate all this particular data at the national safety net program level. So this is called consolidated model. It means reusing this particular data, pushing together into one particular big database here. We call the single registry at the national level. So that was explained clearly in terms of the model. Okay, so you have that. Lastly, we've got a bit of more complex model, which we call the virtual consolidated model. In this particular case, we have the integrated management information system, a software connecting to multiple databases. So it does the connection to multiple databases. Sometimes it fetches this particular data into one database, as exemplified by Turkey. But sometimes there is no database. It's just a software hanging, look at it in terms of hanging in the space, in the cloud, and just does connection, all these particular sector databases. And it does this particular set of integration. So we call that virtual consolidated model. Valentina, you want to have a quick go on maybe Argentina, one example?
Yes, well, Argentina has a very incredibly virtual model because it doesn't even have a single registry. So all it does, it draws information from the tax register, for example, from information on employment, of course, and of course the civil registry. In order to develop a model like this, you need a system where you know that the information you have is comprehensive, that most of the population is covered. Maybe you have more of a formal economy rather than informal economy. So this is, of course, it's not possible in many countries. And Turkey has partially achieved this. A lot of what they've done with their database is drawing information from an incredible amount of different sources and consolidating it, and then linking it to the application data from people who are applying for social assistance. And they'll be talking about this in the bus stop session that we're having after the coffee break.
Excellent. So, and I think just to add more on this, you need some form of high-level IT integration. So IT people will tell you, for example, they will use things like web services, to do this particular link. And again, for you to be able to achieve this, there would be need for some electronic databases existing already within particular sectors. So I think so again, it goes back to what we are saying, what does the context look like in a country? So for you to be able to actually set this up, that would be a scenario. But just to summarize, again, it depends on where the model or the country is in terms of the current status. So it doesn't, for example, mean that this particular setup is the best. And I think that's a critical point to actually make, because I think sometimes we get a bit of wrong advice from a number of teams to say, for example, we may be having this in Kenya, but maybe sometimes we were thinking maybe we should go to this. But assuming, for example, if there was a policy shift, let me use the example of Kenya. If there was a policy shift in Kenya today to create one program out of the 3 or 5 programs that are currently existing, most likely what would happen is the Kenya may actually move from here, from this particular model to this particular model. Again, so it depends on policy changes, again, in terms of the setups of the countries. So it's not really a static model that you have to actually live with. And I think that's a very important actually point to make.